China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has wrapped up his annual Africa tour, a tradition that spans over 3 decades. Wang Yi is also a member of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. Now, this visit underscores China's deep commitment to its partnership with Africa. This year's 4-nation trip took the foreign minister to Namibia, Congo, Brazzaville, Chad, and Nigeria. Now, implementing the outcomes of the 2024 Beijing summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation underpinned Wang's discussions with leaders of these 4 African nations. And this week on the program, we'll explore the symbolism of this 35-year-long practice, as well as the highlights this year, and of course, what lies ahead for China and Africa. I'm Uche Okoronkwo. Welcome to Talk Africa. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has now concluded his 2025 4-nation African tour. He met with African leaders of the respective countries and he discussed the implementation of that 10 partnership action plan. Well, CGTN's Robert Nagila has more details on that.
As China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi flew into Windhoek to begin his week-long Africa tour, the main item on the agenda was the implementation of the outcomes of the FOCAC summit and the strengthening of China-Africa relations. Wang Yi held talks with outgoing President Nangola Mbumba and President-elect Netumbo Nandi-Ndaitwah before flying out to the Republic of Congo, where he met with President Denis Nguesso and his foreign minister. Both sides had reason for optimism.
The Republic of Congo is firmly committed to reinforce solidarity with the People's Republic of China under the framework of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in order to consolidate and develop the relationship between China and Africa.
In accordance with the consensus reached between President Xi Jinping and President Denis Sassou Nguesso, we decided to build a high-level China-Congo community with a shared future, making it a model for the construction of an enduring China-Africa community with a shared future in the new era.
In Chad, the Chinese foreign minister met with President Mahamat Deby before winding up his trip with a visit to Nigeria, where he held discussions with President Bola Tinubu. In a statement, Wang Yi said he had held in-depth talks with leaders of the 4 countries on the implementation of the outcomes of the 2024 China-Africa Forum Summit, which was held in Beijing, and reached a broad consensus. He said China was willing to work with Africa on modernization initiatives proposed by President Xi Jinping, among them zero tariffs on specific items, and to improve investment and trade cooperation. On climate change, which is such a hot topic in Africa now, Wang Yi said they had agreed to implement the Partnership Action for Green Development by implementing clean energy projects. In agriculture, such a key part of Africa's economy, the foreign minister said China would focus on food security, poverty alleviation, capacity building, and partner networks. On reforming the global governance system, Wang Yi said China would support Africa in correcting historical injustices, oppose external interference in Africa's internal affairs, and back Africa's concerns on UN Security Council reform. The tour is part of a 35-year-old tradition that sees Chinese foreign ministers visit Africa as their first overseas trip of the year. Following Wang Yi's Africa visit, the groundwork for the FOCAC Beijing Action Plan 2025-2027 has been established. The next phase is its implementation. Robert Nagila, CGTN, Windhoek, Namibia.
Well, we have a lot to unpack, so let's now bring in our panel of experts. Joining me in Abuja is Charles Onunaiju. He is a director at the Center for China Studies in Nigeria. In London, via Zoom, we're joined by Hannah Ryder. She is the CEO of Development Reimagined. And in Beijing, also via Zoom, Professor John Gong. He is a professor at the University of International Business and Economics. A warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining our discussion today. Well, I'd just like to start off with you, Hannah, because, of course, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he just concluded his annual Africa tour. What's your take on why China consistently places Africa at the top of its diplomatic calendar?
Well, I think we've seen, even from the last Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which happened in September last year, that Africa is central to Chinese foreign policy and has become more so over time. Even just the creation of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation back in 2000 has basically set the bar for how China also works with other regions and also cooperates with others. So I think Africa is not just, a place over there where not much happens. China understands that this is a continent where there is potential, there's a lot of growth, there's a lot of activity, and it's really worth engaging with, and for lots of different reasons. Again, not just political, but also economic. And I think this is when you look at the outcomes of Wang Yi's visit and what African countries were trying to get from it, the economic is a fundamental part of it.
Now, of course, Namibia, Congo, Brazzaville, Chad and Nigeria, these were the countries chosen this year. And Mr. Onunaiju, why do you think these specific countries were chosen for this year's visit?
I think the choice of the countries, which I understand is a product of consensus between the two sides, a product of consultation between the two sides, is based on called the implementation of the outcome of the FOCAC meeting. Like you know, Congo-Brazzaville is the co-chair of FOCAC, and Namibia is an important country in Southwest Africa. Nigeria also is a very important country. Nigerian President Tinubu paid his first ever state visit to China last year and also participated for the first time the FOCAC process. And of course, Chad is an important country also. I think no country in Africa, to my understanding, is more important than the other to China. But I think there is a general understanding that countries, he can visit all the countries in Africa at the same time. And the choice is more or less based on a common understanding that this visit has a ramification for the entire African continent. Of course, individual countries that I visited has focused roles to play, but generally it has a ramification for the entire region, yes.
And we'll get into that later, but Professor Gong, we know the Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he made a lot of pledges on this trip. Specifically, he said that China is ready to work with African nations, especially to implement the outcomes of the Beijing summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, or the FOCAC as we call it. He's looking to jointly advance that 10 partnership action plan, which will, of course, be spread over 3 years. But what exactly do you think are the most pressing issues from the action plan going forward, and which ones do you see as being more long-term?
This is a long-held tradition in China's diplomacy, in that the first official diplomatic activity from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has always been a visit to Africa. This is a tradition going back many years. I myself been invited to commenting on this activity almost every year for the last 3 or 4 years. And I think there's a reason why the first diplomatic mission from China's foreign ministry is going to Africa by the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And this highlights the importance of Africa in China's foreign policy. The second thing is that, with respect to your question, I think, the cooperation between China and Africa, mostly manifesting economic cooperation. China has this Belt and Road Initiative, been implementing, infrastructure building plan for many countries in Africa. No single country in the world has been building so many things. Infrastructures, bridges, highways, ports, railways, all these critical infrastructures in Africa to such a large extent, on such a large scale. And I think this trend is going to continue. With respect to the China-Africa Forum, the summit successfully held last year in Beijing, there's a whole list of things President Xi has committed to during that meeting, during that summit. And I think Minister Wang Yi's mission is to follow up on these commitments, to implement these things that being committed by the President of China, and do real things for Africa, not just the lip service, but things that make an impact, make things different in Africa.
Quite right. Like Professor said, this trip is about fulfilling specific commitments going forward. So Hannah, I'd like to bring you into the discussion again. Let's get into the outcomes we saw in the different countries that he visited. As of course, Mr. Onunaiju mentioned, Congo is the co-chair of FOCAC this year. So while we saw the Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Brazzaville, he said that both China and Congo are basically formulating a timetable and a roadmap for the development of FOCAC over the next 3 years. Now, as the forum's co-chair, how do you expect to see Congo leading the efforts to implement that 10 partnership action plan, particularly in terms of addressing infrastructure, as the professor mentioned, as well as areas like power and, of course, industrialization across Africa?
Yes, I think so. Republic of Congo is not going to have an easy job. Senegal was the previous co-chair of the Foreign China-Africa Corporation, and they did that for 6 years and obviously did a fantastic job. And Republic of Congo will want to do exactly the same, if not more. And I think there is a great deal of pressure on Congo to do so, because those commitments that were made at FOCAC in 2024 were really worked very hard from all sides, and especially financial commitments. We had the $51 billion commitment, including export credits and investment, and then commitments around value addition, and as you mentioned, energy as well. So while, obviously Congo itself has its own bilateral relationship that it wants to take forward with China, at the same time, it also has to prioritize delivering on the FOCAC co-chairmanship. And that means being able to track what's happening across a whole range of different countries. And it is not easy, again, in terms of there's so much activity. If we're talking about industrialization, we see even just last year, 10 different cement plants, more than a whole number of steel plants, number of energy projects, more than 100 energy projects worked on with Chinese support, not just financial support, to a degree financial support, but also technical advice and also construction. So there's just so much to keep track of. So it will be challenging, and that's exactly why a roadmap is required, so that it's not just the Chinese side who are monitoring, it's also from the African side, that they're also checking what's happening and making sure that, again, certain regional priorities, if you think about what the African Union, for example, has said are priorities for infrastructure, that their priorities for infrastructure building are the ones that China's really considering in terms of those $51 billion spending. So these are the sorts of issues that have to be worked on with Congo's leadership.
And Professor Gong, what about Namibia? Because we just saw the country go through a change in leadership. And of course, Wang Yi said that China remains committed to supporting the country's economic development. It's looking to help them transform its resources, advantages in terms of its resources into developmental and also societal benefits in the country. So how do you expect to see China doing this?
Yeah, well, China is also a fairly sizable investor in Namibia. It's a very resourceful, rich country, and cooperations in explorations of natural resources been ongoing. I think for the most part, Namibia economy has been doing fairly well. I remember there's a famous conversation between the German ambassador and the Namibia president, and the German ambassador was complaining about there are too many Chinese coming into Namibia, and the Namibia president thankfully totally rebutted his view. And I think this testifies to the importance of the friendliness of the relationship between China and Namibia. And I think at a very fundamental level, China's business and commercial presence in African countries in general is very different from the European colonial powers operations in Africa, decades ago. It's fundamentally different. We cooperate. We do things based on mutual benefit, based on mutual understanding and mutual consent, most importantly. So I think with the additional investments from China and build out these infrastructures in Africa, things will turn for the good of a lot of people in Africa. You mentioned the words industrialization. I think it's extremely important that Africa needs to be industrialized. And this is against the backdrop of rising labor costs and also other costs here in China. And there's a general trend that some of the manufacturing is actually moving out of China. And my personal view is that hopefully some of these manufacturing operations will go to Africa to create jobs, to create business opportunities, and in general, it can contribute to the local economy and stimulate economic development in a way that it also benefits the people in these countries, creating jobs and raising their living standards. Hopefully, this can happen in the years to come.
On that note, let's take a short break, and when we return, we'll be unpacking the key takeaways from Wang Yi's visit and also examining what China-Africa relations could look like in 2025. Stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue that discussion. And still with me is Mr. Charles Onunaiju in Abuja and, of course, Hannah Ryder in London. Mr. Onunaiju, of course, we know Chad is a Sahelian country with, of course, a number of security challenges. It also has vast untapped economic potential. Meanwhile, Nigeria is a global crude exporter and also Africa's largest economy. What are these strategic and economic benefits to Africa of Wang Yi's visit to Chad and also to the giant that is Nigeria?
Of course, like you suggested, his visit has a significant impact in the region, in the sub-region, especially in the Sahel, where you have quite a number of security challenges. And during his visit, there were a whole range of discussions around the issues of security, keying into China's initiative and the global security process. So I think the ramification of his visit, especially to Nigeria and Chad, underlines China's concern and interest in addressing the security issues in this region. There were understanding about training of Nigerian military, support for Nigerian military, logistics support, intelligence sharing, and experience sharing in anti-terrorism fight. These are all very relevant to Nigeria and, of course, to Chad.
In Nigeria, the foreign minister specifically emphasized supporting African solutions to African problems. How will we see this principle manifest in China's collaboration with Nigeria, especially on issues such as regional security and also modernization going forward?
In my view, the Nigerian-African solution, being in the framework of being in the forefront of solving African problems, is a common understanding that Africa shares with China. China has constantly re-emphasized that solution to African problems should be African playing very important role, of course, with partners engaging and supporting Africa in that respect. And we have seen China's practical engagement in that respect, providing support at all times to African countries in support of their effort to solve African problems, whether it is the African Peace and Security Commission or whether it is Africa fight against infectious disease, strengthening their capacity and the institutions through support for institutional capacity building. We've seen the support in building the Africa Center for Disease, AU. These are all support to build African capacity to address issues relating to the continent and being in the driving seat when it comes to solving African problems. So I think the long-term collaboration between China and Africa in driving this process is basically a consensus reached by both sides. Of course, Nigeria is a regional power with considerable reach, and would also want to continuously work with China. Like you know, the foreign minister discountenanced totally the idea of private military security in Africa. Right. He suggested that Africa can work with partners like China to address security issues.
I just wanted to bring Hannah into the discussion because I'd like to get her take on this emphasis on supporting African solutions to African problems. How do you think we'll see that sort of manifested in collaboration going forward?
We often associate it with this idea of security, military, peacekeeping, and so on. And it should be, rightly so, in many ways that is a major challenge. But I think it's also related to a more general aspect around supporting African institutions and supporting African voices in global governance. We saw China being one of the first countries, and at heads of state level, the first country to support the African Union joining the G20, for example, and this year will be South Africa's presidency of the G20, and which South Africa expects to have a major emphasis on Africa. Others have had a major emphasis on Africa, not least just Brazil just recently, but this is an opportunity for Africa to take. And so in terms of African solutions, this will be one, African solutions can also come forward there and be proposed, and hopefully China can be one of the key partners that supports the African agenda at the G20.
Global dynamics have been shifting both politically and economically as well. We have the return of Trump to the White House. Of course, it has implications for Africa, such as the future of AGOA. What are the challenges or opportunities you think may arise for China-Africa cooperation? Do you see the shifting global dynamics changing the relationship going forward?
I think the new president in the US returning president in the US is obviously going to shake things up in general. However, when it comes to the China-Africa relationship, I think it's not going to make a huge difference. Yet at the same time, there is opportunity for China and African countries to really show leadership where there are vacuums. Now, not to say that that leadership shouldn't, there shouldn't still be international pressure for that leadership. But in an area, for example, like climate change, which we know there has been obvious challenges with the US and the incoming president, there is an opportunity in terms of really showing what green development looks like. And I think the partnership between China and Africa can strengthen in that area and would meet African goals. And I think the key point really is for African countries to be very strategic, to be really focused on each partner one by one and what they, Africa first, each partner one by one, what they want to get from that partner. And I think if African countries do that, and I think they will, then the relationship with China can strengthen. And in some cases, the relationship with the US may even strengthen, but in very, very different places, most likely.
Now, I'd like to ask both of you what your take is on what lies ahead for China and Africa cooperation this year. For example, how significant a role do you think the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will play in the next chapter of trade relations between the two? I'll start with you, Mr. Onunaiju.
I believe that going forward, the two sides will play a very significant role in advancing multilateralism and advocating for reforms of the global governance process with a view to make it more inclusive and more participatory. And of course, the African free trade is a big continental trade framework. China has a great role to play with it. With industrial and production capacity cooperation between China and Africa, we can see Africa moving to become a prime mover in the fourth industrial revolution, and seizing the opportunity to become the next workshop of the world. This is possible within the AFTA process. But the question is, Africa also needs to harmonize, because we've had experiments in free continental trade. We have the African Economic Community. We have other frameworks of economic community. But in most cases, there has been challenges of harmonizing both the institutions, the soft institutions, and the hard institutions, and then engendering economy of scale, comparative advantage within the continent. Right. These are all going to play a role in the success of the African free trade, especially with China's involvement.
And Hannah, I'd like to get your take on what you just said. Basically, when you look to the next chapter of China-Africa relations, what is your take on what we're going to see going forward? Not just in terms of trade, as Mr. Onunaiju talked about, but you mentioned climate change as well. And we did see China support Africa at the UN Climate Change Conference in terms of advocating for climate justice going forward. We saw China announce the Africa Solar Belt program as well. And a key issue, as richer nations continue to fall short on those commitments to scale up financing to Africa for adaptation, green growth going forward, how essential do you think China will be to Africa's energy transition?
Yeah, so I see three major themes coming forward in 2025 for the China-Africa relationship. And I think Wang Yi himself, in terms of his visit, has really set the tone. In Namibia, we saw him talking about the renewable energy capacity, including the Africa Solar Program and so on. Green development is going to be key. And I think not just in terms of infrastructure and using that, a good proportion, I hope, of the $51 billion committed from China at FOCAC, but also in terms of some of the green goods, the environmental goods, whether it's electric vehicles, both 2, 3, 5, 4-wheelers and buses and so on, all of those not just being shipped to African countries, but also increasingly being assembled and manufactured in African countries. And I think we'll see a great deal of progress on that this year. The second theme I think we'll see is generally on infrastructure. I think the message at FOCAC, again with the financial commitments and again with Wang Yi, is that China's back and interested in infrastructure support, and with Nigeria's outcome with the new transport support, 250 million or so, I think emphasizes this and kind of shows this is going to be a major area to watch for 2025. And then last but not least, this aspect of industrialization. We talked about it already. Chinese private sector is very active, looking at outsourcing to African countries, but also on its own, on the basis of African demands, whether it's cement, steel, pharmaceuticals. We're seeing a lot more private sector enterprises going to the African continent. And I think the uptick that we can expect in foreign direct investment, not just brownfield, buying existing investments, but also greenfield in a whole range of different areas, even agriculture, I would expect. So this is, I think there's going to be a great deal of activity. Wang Yi and the African countries that he visited have really set the tone, and we can expect a lot more activity in 2025.
Well, we'll certainly be watching. That's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A huge thank you to our guests. Of course, Charles Onunaiju, Director at the Center for China Studies in Nigeria. We're also joined by Hannah Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined. And of course, earlier we had Professor John Gong, a professor at the University of International Business and Economics. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation through our social media platforms on Facebook and X. And you can watch this and other editions of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist. Do join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. From me, Uche Okoronkwo, and of course the rest of the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.